Essentially, the story goes that he was involved in the death of the rightful king, who was his half-brother Edward, when he was just 16 years old. Now then, when he comes to the throne, he is attacked by the Vikings, who raid, and the only way, instead of actually fighting them, that he deals with this is by paying them tribute every single time, this being the famous Danegeld that he keeps paying. Now, of course, he's known as Æthelred the Unready because he was never ready when the Danes were, and he keeps paying them, and instead of actually fighting back, he just keeps paying them tribute. Now, of course, the Anglo-Saxons are getting rather annoyed at this stage, and they ask him to do something, so when he finally gets the guts to fight someone, he instead kills the women and children of the Danes who were living in England. Now, of course, this enrages Svein Forkbeard, whose sister is killed in these attacks in the so-called St. Brice's Day massacre, who then sends another fleet to England, and they keep trying to fight, and they keep getting defeated, and Bob's your uncle. Before you know it, Æthelred is dead, and England is part of the Danish Empire. But there are a few reasons why this narrative is fake news. So first of all, it comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and then through the Anglo-Norman historians like John of Worcester and William of Malmesbury, who wrote over 100 years after the events. Now, they wanted to find out why was Æthelred so bad at being a king, and they did think he was a bad king. But again, we have to remember that they are writing with considerable hindsight. They are writing in a period where they know that Æthelred the Unready, that at the end of his reign there is a Danish conquest, that England falls and becomes part of the Danish Empire. So of course they're going to be skewed against his actions because they know that he fails as a king in that regard. In a similar way, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that they were using as sources weren't written in the reign of Æthelred that we have access to, but they were written in the reign of Knut, so these are also skewed in favour of Knut and against Æthelred. Now, it's very interesting. What we do have is one extract. There's 1 year where we do have two accounts. One that was written in the year it's describing in 1001, and one that's written in 1020, which is the manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where we have pretty much all the information about Æthelred's reign. Now, if we compare the two, we find some very interesting things. Now, this is the one written in 1001, so the contemporary account of the event that happened in that year. Then they went from there to the mouth of the Exe, so that they transported themselves in one journey until they reached Pinho, and opposing them there were Kola, the king's high reeve, and Eadseer, the king's reeve. And with what army they could gather, but they were put to flight there, and many were killed, and the Danes had control of the field. And the next morning they burnt the residence at Pinho and Clust, and many other good residences which we cannot name, and then went back east till they reached the Isle of Wight. And then the next morning they burnt the residence at Waltham and many other villages, and soon afterwards terms were made with them, and they accepted peace. If we compare this now to this account from 1020, so 19 years after the event and in Knut's reign, we can see some major changes have been made. Then an immense army was gathered there of the people of Devon and Somerset, and they met at Pinho, and as soon as they joined battle the people gave way, and the Danes made a great slaughter there, and then rode over the land. And ever their next raid was worse than the one before it, and they brought much booty with them to their ships, and turned from there to the Isle of Wight. And there they went about as they pleased, and nothing withstood them, and no naval force on land nor land force dared go against them, no matter how far inland they went. It was in every way grievous, for they never ceased from their evil doing. So you can see that one of them really hypes up the situation a lot more. What was probably a rather small-scale skirmish in the west of the country has been turned into this immense battle where the entire west country is left burning. So when you consider that apart from this one entry from 1001, all the other entries from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles that we have are from the same one from 1020, you can see why we might have a slight issue on our hands. Now, this also works the same way. For example, the Battle of Maldon, if you're at all interested in this period, will seem like a huge battle of extreme importance that we know a lot about compared to other battles of the period. And this is because there survives a poem, which is the Battle of Maldon, which is an amazing poem in Old English about this battle and about the heroism and exactly what happened there. And we know that there was the Earl Buchnoth, and that there was a ford, and that he let the Vikings come across the ford, and that then he fell in the battle, and then some of the Englishmen ran, and that's where the Vikings won the day. But if we didn't have this poem, the only other reference we would have to the Battle of Maldon and what we would know would be this one entry from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 991, which reads, "Here Ipswich was raided, and very soon after that Ealdman Buchnoth was killed at Maldon." and that'll be it. So we also have the fact that what survives to us obviously is only a small portion of what there is. There's a lot more to be known, but it does also skew the facts. We're not actually sure whether what's in the poem of the Battle of Maldon was actually what happened at the Battle of Maldon. It's what a poet imagined happened at the Battle of Maldon, but whether he was there, whether he had sources from people who were there, we're not entirely sure. So we're not sure whether that's an accurate depiction or not. So this is just to show that what we have is often very biased, and it's very much in the bias against Æthelred that we have these sources. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at Æthelred's reign. But you might be thinking, if we can't trust the sources that we have, how on earth can we know what Æthelred was really like? Well, to quote my favourite Anglo-Saxon historian, then we have three things that are our friends: coins, charters, and law codes. Let's take a look at coins. Now the first one is called the First Small Cross, and then we can see that on the obverse we have a portrait of the king, and also around the edge we have Æthelred Rex Anglo, which is Latin for Æthelred King of England, and on the reverse we have a small cross, which is why it's called the small cross type, as well as Leofstan moat on, and I couldn't quite make out where this was moat, so where it was made, but it says that Leofstan was a moneyer at, and then the place of origin. Now this coin was actually exactly the same as one of his fathers, King Edgar, who was known as King Æthelred the Peaceful, because there was very little conflict during his reign, and he had an extensive reformation of the coinage, with having the portrait of the king on one side and a various design on the other. Now what's important about this reformation is that we also get various recoinages, which is when the coins are all taken back in, so they stop their circulation and they produce a new one. And what this means is that we can date coins to certain periods, and the patterns that come out after certain periods that are on the coins, the symbols there, are very important because it shows what was important to the king at the time and what they were trying to show with it. Now coins at this time were being used by everyday people in trade, so it's important that this was a direct contact between the everyday people of the kingdom and the king themselves. So this was a way for the king to communicate with his people in a time before mass media, obviously, because it's the Anglo-Saxon period. So we can learn a lot from what the king wants to say by looking at the coins, and this is true for Æthelred too. So the first one that he has is called the First Hand, and you can see that the portrait has switched sides, and there's the Alpha and the Omega and the Hand of Providence all on the other. So it's quite a religious theme, and that's a theme that'll keep coming up. And we can see here that the moneyer is Beornulf, who was active at London, which was a very important site at this time, and starts to overtake other candidates as the most important city in Anglo-Saxon England during this period. Now in 991 there's a very interesting coin that's very short-lived, and it's called the Benediction coin. And this coin had a lot of religious symbols on it, and the reason that this is important is because 991 is the date that a large Viking fleet led by the King of Denmark, Svein Forkbeard, and probably also containing the troops and ships of Olaf Tryggvason, who would later become the King of Norway, came to England. And 991 is the year of the Battle of Maldon. So this was a campaign that was fought in Essex against probably an encamped Danish fleet that was there. And it's thought that these religious symbols on the coin were important because obviously this was them trying to get God on side for the campaign. But of course the campaign failed and they lost the Battle of Maldon. And they went on to raid places like London. And that's why they pulled the coin in after 991 very quickly, because this campaign had failed. So it's essentially a way of using coins as a sort of royal propaganda to get both God and the people on side, get them hyped up for this campaign against the Danes, although of course they failed in this instant. Now the next coin that they used was called the crux, which is Latin for cross, and we can see that the portrait has returned to the original side. We also see that the king is now holding a scepter. There's more royal imagery there. He's trying to assert his dominance more, as well as wearing the trefoil, which is often used. It's the three sort of bangs of the hair that's there, which we'll see later on again. Now on the other side we can see that there's a cross in the middle. The cross, of course, very religious, and we also have cross or crux written in Latin, which is cross, inside the four segments there. So there's more invocation to God in these coins with these religious symbols. And of course by having them on the coins you're spreading this throughout the kingdom. So there's a spread maybe of wanting to get God on side throughout the kingdom. Now, of course, the reason why this was issued from 991 is because, again, we get the large fleet with Olaf Tryggvason, who was going to become the king of Norway, coming to England. We then obviously get the Battle of Malden, which is fought and lost, and then they move on to London. So after the benediction coin from that campaign, this fleet that comes over doesn't actually leave. We don't actually get any mention that they leave until a bit later on. So then the Viking raids really step up after 991. The next type is called the helmet type, being used from 1003 to 1009, and here we can see that Æthelred has got himself portrayed with a helmet and wearing mail, and this is probably in tune with the increasing militarization of England. Now, the Viking fleet that I mentioned staying from 991 doesn't actually leave until 1005, and when it does leave, it's because there's a great famine in England, so they obviously don't want to starve, which is why they go. But during this time, there were many battles fought, like at Ringmere, for example, in East Anglia, and so a lot of, and also what we see in the charters as well, is that there's a lot of mobilization of men, and there's a lot of smithying going on, of making armor and helmets and weapons for the fjords for the armed men of England to use. And this again is portrayed in the coins, showing Æthelred as a warrior who is going to go out and face the Danes in battle, whether he did that or not. But the reason that we know so much about Æthelred's coins is, one, because he has a very long reign, and two, because so many of them are actually found in Scandinavia, because of course he paid a lot of tribute to the Scandinavians, and then they buried them in large hoards, which is why we find all sorts of these coins in the Scandinavian hoards, and it's why it's one of the most useful tools for further understanding Æthelred's reign, as opposed to other kings who didn't pay tribute to the Danes, and that's why we don't really know much about them, from their coins at least. The accusation most often levelled against Æthelred is that he simply didn't do anything when the Vikings kept coming, that he was just unready every time that the Danes were. Now, this is, in some senses, if you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it seems that this is the case, but if you delve deeper, then we can find other things. And actually, one of the ways in which he most responded to the Viking threat isn't a way we would really consider doing so today, at least for most people. But back in the early Middle Ages, and in fact throughout most of the Middle Ages, this would have been the way to deal with a major crisis. And this was to look inwards at the church and to see what kind of sins they had committed, because they saw, and actually throughout Europe, actually, if you read a lot of the sources, they saw the Vikings as being punishment for their sins from God. Now, there are a few reasons why Æthelred might think that God has it out for him and for the English people, and by having a quick look at the earlier history of the church in England during this time, and at some of the personal reasons, then we can start to get an idea why Æthelred might think that the way to stop the Viking invasions is by sorting out the church and by doing penitence to God. So if we take a quick look at his father's reign, this was from 959 to 975, and this was Edgar the Peaceful, who we've already mentioned as reforming the coinage. Now, during his reign, we get what's known as the Benedictine reform really taking root in England. It started in France, and it was essentially a reform movement that wanted really the clergy to actually follow the law of Benedict, the rule of Benedict, that they would be serious clergy, that they wouldn't go around and be greedy, and they wouldn't go around and become fat and have lots of children and things like that, but that they would be strict and follow and really be a community in and of themselves, rather than going out and doing lots of worldly things as the lay clergy were doing. And they really did take England by storm, at least south of the Humber. So we get, for example, that in I believe it's the New Minster in Winchester, that literally the clergy that were there before were chased out by the Benedictines, and that they really took root in lots of monastic organizations. What we also get is that a lot of nobles, whether freely or under duress, or there's various accounts, that they give lots of land and money and privileges and patronage to these Benedictine houses in England at the time. But there would be a reaction to this, and actually on the death of Edgar, we get what's known as the anti-monastic reaction. Oftentimes this would be the children of the nobleman who in Edgar's reign had given land to the church, because obviously that land that had been given to the church would otherwise have gone to them. That's where their basic source of income came from, and we get really quite a violent reaction that occurs here. Now, we don't know in too much detail, but there are saints' lives that describe the kind of troubles that occurred, and it seems that in Edgar's reign he'd been keeping a lid on all sorts of pressures, and that as soon as he died, then the milk boiled over, so to speak, and and everyone went a bit nuts in England, especially against the church and the in what's known as the anti-monastic reaction by the people. So a lot of the land that had been given to the church is taken back, and things start to return to the way that they were before this reform movement. Now obviously Edward was only a young man when he came to the throne, just in his early teens. And he dies in a very mysterious way at Corfe Castle. And really Æthelred is probably implicated in his death. Of course, he's the half-brother. There was a struggle to succeed anyway, but Edward seems to have come out on top. But then Æthelred, very, very lucky for Æthelred, Edward dies at Corfe Castle just 3 years after becoming king, which is really quite dodgy. And to make matters worse, there's this cult that grows up around Edward, who's known as Edward the Martyr. So there's a real question about, is this a coup forming against Æthelred's early government? As well as this cult that forms, he actually has to struggle against the anti-monastic reaction, which spills over into the early reign of Æthelred. But actually what he does later on, when the Viking attacks start to become more intense, is he kind of reverses this again and once again starts to give privileges and grants and patronage to various churches. And actually the Old Minster in Winchester, this very, very grand church that's being built, is actually completed during his reign. And I'm going to look into some of these charters in just a second, so we can really see that he's pushing for the church once again after it's taken a bit of a hit during his early reign and under Edward, for example, to try and get God back on side by being good to the church, which is of course the representation of God on earth. And really we can see this throughout the Middle Ages. For example, if you think when plague strikes, what did they do? Well, they'd fast, they'd pray, they'd whip themselves for their sins, all of this. So it's a really common reaction in the Middle Ages to turn inwards and to look to what kind of divine punishment there could be. Now if we take a look at some of the charters, we see just this happening. So one of the first is in Abingdon in 993, and interestingly enough here he reaffirms the right of the monastery there to choose their own bishops there, which was actually done by the king beforehand, but he gives them special privileges there. Another interesting one is in Cornwall, which is in 995, and this was essentially saying that the Bishop of Cornwall had the same rights, diocesan rights. There was another bishop who was saying, oh, Cornwall falls under my jurisdiction, probably because then he could get all the tithe, the revenues from Cornwall. But here the king is explicitly saying, no, Æthelred, the Bishop of Cornwall, he has the same rights as any other bishop, and probably this is again in the same vein of trying to sort out the interior of the church, but also because Cornwall is a strategic location. It was raided several times, and by going around Cornwall, the Viking fleets obviously would have access to rivers like the Severn, so they could sail right inland and attack, just as we saw with the accounts of the attack on Pinho, which I showed earlier in the video. So it's probably also a strategic move to try and get the bishop on side, to try and get him in the organisation, in the position to organise the various defences there. Another we have in Muckley in 995, again reaffirming the rights of the various bishops and dioceses there. And also in around 992 we get the completion of the Old Minster in Winchester, this really, really grand church that unfortunately doesn't survive anymore, but there are some great pictures online that you can have a look at, although they're not copyright free so I can't show them in my video, but it was really a really grand church. So we see all of this moving on in the background of him trying to appease God. Now, very interesting thing that we also see, and that hints at underlying trouble in the church, is an account from 986 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which says, this year the king laid waste the bishopric of Rochester. Now, Frank Stenton, although he was a great Anglo-Saxon historian, really laid the foundations for the modern study, described this as an episode of spasmodic violence on the part of Æthelred. But really, if we read further into this, we get a sense that there's a deeper history going on here. And to describe what I mean, if we look at the various royal diplomas, they always have a list of signatories and those who were there and witnessed the diploma. And if we look at the clergy that are there, we see an interesting pattern. Now, the Bishop Alfstan of Rochester is always present, but then suddenly in 985 and the next 2 years, he's no longer present at these at all of these charters being signed and these royal assemblies where these charters are made. What's interesting about this is that he then comes back in 988, so just after the attack on Rochester. So we get the idea that there's something going on between either the bishop and the king, or that the bishop is having issues in Rochester and that there's a falling out, and that's why then Æthelred goes into Rochester with an army and ravages the city, perhaps again to do with this reform, although unfortunately we don't have much more information information, but this again, it hints at some kind of underlying trouble within the church that Æthelred is trying to sort out in 986. And interestingly enough, we then get in 995 that there is another charter that is directed towards Rochester, giving it special privileges. So perhaps this is Æthelred looking for atonement for his earlier crimes in Rochester, or this is him trying to get Rochester back on side after he's obviously ravaged the city. Probably something to do with the church there, but we're not sure. And then we also have another charter from 997 in Winchester, again giving special privileges there. So a really interesting year, and where we get a lot of information is 1009. Now the reason why 1009 a lot of things start to kick off is that is when a very large invasion fleet lands, and this is in fact that of Thorkel Hinhauve, or in Old English that's not in Old English, in Modern English that would be Thorkel the Tall, and he is one of the most powerful magnates from Denmark. In fact, he was from Skåne, which is now in Sweden, but it was a very powerful region, and he lands with a very large force in 1009. And because of this, we see this great reaction. Now in the coinage, we can see, for example, that this coin, the Agnus Dei, which is literally the Lamb of God, which is depicted, is issued, and it's full of holy symbols and things that we can see here. So it's got the Lamb of God. It's also got a dove flying upwards, again pointing towards God, the dove, the symbol of peace as well. So we can see that this is a religious reaction that's occurring on the coins. Now in the law codes as well, we have something even more extraordinary, and this is the law code known as Æthelred 7. And if we look at this law code, we can see that actually there's this amazing reaction, which is that the king orders a 3-day fast before Michaelmas, which is in September-October time, on the Monday, the Tuesday, and the Wednesday. And then we can see in this charter that every man is to go barefoot to the church, and all the slaves are not allowed to work so that they can observe the fast, and they've got to pray for the king and the country and give in the money, and that the money is to be distributed, and that every minster and community are to sing their psalters all day long for those 3 days. And it's this amazing whole-scale reaction of getting every soul in England to pray to God for the success of Æthelred against this very large, very serious, and seriously well-trained, which I'll get into in another video, army led by Thorkel in 1009 that again underlies this reaction that isn't necessarily, but there certainly was a military reaction as well, which I will also get into. But this is the main reaction for Æthelred, is a religious reaction, not a military reaction against these Viking invasions that occur.